All this time Smiggles was howling to be let down so that he could join in. With a shrill whistle blast, the king announced that the soup would be served. He served it in his water pistol. Dangerous jets of tomato soup shot everywhere. No one but the weather snake had an umbrella. The botter snakes found the safest place was under the table with their gumballs held in front of them, rolled thin. When all the soup had been served or spilled and Smiggles released, the king thought the party needed livening up. Most of the botter snakes under the table were asleep, so the king started throwing things. The rest of his presents, the rotten fruit, were excellent for livening up the party. Against a water pistol, the botter snakes were helpless, but when the king threw rotten fruit, they scraped it up and threw it back. The party went fast and very furious. When the fruit became squashed to a pulp, they threw gumballs instead. Gumballs could be thrown again and again. Quite soon the king became tired of throwing the party. He was being hit too often. Blowing a fierce blast on his whistle, he yelled, "Half-time!" Smiggles, who was very sore at missing so much of the fun, especially about the tail, took no notice. He hurled his last gumball, it happened to be Tinking Gumble, and scored a direct hit on the king's nose. This made Smiggles feel much better. Less fortunately, it made the king swallow his whistle. It went on whistling inside him each time he took a deep breath. The king was exceedingly angry. His ears glowed, his tummy whistled. He unwrapped Tinking Gumble from his nose and rolled him in a tight ball to throw back. As soon as he was about to throw, a loud tink sounded, clear as the call of a bellbird. "Hooray!" shouted Tinking Gumble. "It wasn't lost after all. It only got stuck." "Quiet!" yelled the king. "Feet!" went his tummy. Tinking Gumble couldn't help it. The king was squeezing very hard and it made him tink madly, like a cash register in Woolworth's, the grocery store. Everyone a good idea. "That's the one that causes all the bother," said Chink airily. "Clever snake," the king snarled and threw Tinking Gumble at him. The tinker bounced and rolled under a bush where he sat down to sort out all the good ideas that had come unstuck. "It don't matter," said Glob, helping himself to Chink's bottle tops. "Clunks are better'n tinks any day." Before this could be proved, the king said, "I will make a speech. Then we'll have a sleep. Then we'll throw some more party. Grab them gumballs and pop them in jam tins." During the throwing, the jam tins had been scattered far and wide, so to save themselves bother, the botter snakes squashed the gumballs together in one big mass in the empty soup tureen, saying they'd sort 'em out in the morning. This was worse for the gumballs than jam tinning because those beneath could hardly breathe. But there was no help for it, and there they had to stay while the king made his birthday speech. The speech was long and dull. At first the botter snakes sat on the table and listened, pounding with their spoons at the important places. Then one by one they dozed off, and at last the king put himself to sleep with his own speech. Only Smiggles was awake. He had been hung up again to prevent the disappearance of the soup tureen. Old Smig wasn't having much of a party yet, but there were still 2.5 more days to go. The Gumballs knew this too. Inside the soup tureen they were struggling and wriggling to escape, and they had found that they were not stuck to the bottom of the tureen, as it was still slippery with the thick red soup, but they were stuck fast to each other because the botter snakes had jammed them in so tightly. If we could only get unstuck from each other, they thought, we'd be free. Push and wriggle as they might, they could not pull themselves apart. What they did manage to do was make themselves into one big gumball, a clumsy creature, but it could walk and move its arms and waggle its huge head, and it could talk in a deep, boomy voice. It was a giant gumball. Little Willie was stuck on behind like a tail. He wagged. A bit soupy around the edges, the giant gumball stepped out of the train and loosened up like a genie just out of the bottle. "Yikes!" yelled Smiggles, who could not remember having dreamed a monster. The giant lifted Smiggles down, finding he could do it easily, and when the giant found how strong he was, he laughed, "Ho, ho, ho," in his deep, boomy voice. He put Smiggles in the soup tureen and slapped a lid on. From there, for the dreamer, sleep would be the only escape. The giant gumball lumbered forward, followed by his own huge shadow, for it was night now, and the moon was up. And when the giant saw how big his shadow was, he laughed. Ho, 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 in his booming giant's voice. He looked at the snoring snakes and thought and knew that he need not be afraid. I am too big, said that giant, for a jam tin. Rattling about in the giant's head was a bright idea that might once have been a tink. With a long piece of rope, he joined the botter snakes together, knotted it tightly around each tail a bit above the tassel, and the two ends of rope he joined on the tail of the king. This party, said the giant, needs livening up. He overturned the table, botter snakes and all. They woke, hopping mad immediately. Someone's head needed sitting on, and that was plain. Up they got to see whose head it would be. Sit on it, yelled the furious king, till the middle of next week. Foo, said the giant. The king fell over in astonishment. No one had said foo to him in his whole reign. The giant clambered to the roof of his king's palace and stood there right against the moon. He looked huge, much too big to do as he was told. Wow, yelled the botter snakes. The king was not so easily scared. It's only Smiggles. He's been dreaming again, he roared. No, I ain't, came a muffled voice in the soup tureen. I didn't have nothing to do with it. Now the tureen was talking, or so it seemed to the frightened snakes. One or two scaredy cats tried to run away, but could not get far because of the rope around their tails. Let me go, they yelled. Stop pulling my tail. Beep, beep, went the king's tummy. The royal tail was being pulled too. Slowly at first, the botter snakes of the king's band and the king too began to go round in a circle. Some trying to run away, some trying to stop their tails being pulled off. Round they went, faster and faster, whirling, glowing, sparks shooting from their red-hot ears, while a magnificent Catherine wheel fit for a giant to watch. And once it was spinning, nothing in the world could stop it until the rope snapped. The Catherine wheel burst into glowing stars then, and the giant clapped his hands. That was the end of the party. He slid off the car and strode away to the bush, still filling the moonlit night with the boom of his ho, ho, ho. The giant shook and rocked with laughter. The giant shook himself to pieces. Ordinary Gumballs came tumbling out of his arms and legs, his head and his tummy, and soon the giant was lying in little gumbo bits and pieces on the ground. Very pleased to be their ordinary selves again, the bits and pieces scampered off to find some games to play in moonshine. No more parties, no more jam tins, they told each other, still giggling. And we'll never let ourselves get caught again. We'll never be so silly. You weren't quite right about that. Botter snakes are always having parties, and the trouble with Gumballs is that when they go giggly, they are silly enough for anything. So this story ends with this little epilogue. Make sure that you cut all the food pictures out of papers and magazines before you throw them in the bush. By the way, and be careful to remove the bottoms from your empty jam tins, too. Or better still, don't throw tins and papers into the bush at all. The end.